Oh, ladies and gentlemen, I can hear a hush descending on the room. Well, a very warm welcome to the prison tonight for this event. I'm Matthew Crago. I'm the head of the College of Arts at the University of Lincoln, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all. We're here for three reasons. We're here firstly to celebrate 800 years from the actual signing of the 1215 Magna Carta. We're here secondly to celebrate the launch of a new artistic project entitled Gnawed by Rats, which is Emma Rushton and Derek Tyman's project. And we're here finally to listen to a lecture by a very, very eminent historian from America, Peter Linebaugh. Now, I'm not going to say anything more about the first of those three things because I imagine that Peter himself will address some of those things. But just suffice it to say that Gnawed by Rats is a two-year project which is a collaboration between the University of Lincoln and Lincoln City Council, and it's about comparing and contrasting the two charters which are going to dominate heritage in the city in the next few years. That's, of course, Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forests. And you'll find on your seats a piece of paper which relates to that project, and the artists, Emma and Derek, would be very interested to hear from you if you have some ideas about how to progress the project. Tonight's speaker is Peter Linebaugh, who's actually from the University of Toledo, recently retired from the University of Toledo, a very, very eminent historian of really the rights of the people. In 1975, a very famous collection of essays, and those of you who actually study social history in Britain will know Albion's Fatal Tree, of which Peter was one of the co-editors with E.P. Thompson. And since then, a succession of important books about criminal justice, still prolifically producing books. The latest one, I hope there's a copy right here, in fact, the Magna Carta Manifesto, but also recently a book called Stop Thief, The Commons, Enclosures and Resistance. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Peter here tonight. The title of his talk is The Future of the Charters of Liberty in the 21st Century, From Homo Idioticus to Femina Communis. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Peter Linebaugh.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and welcome everybody to this prison. I come from a country that has the highest prison population in the world, and therefore I'm going to begin, at the risk of repetition, reading to you from the Magna Carta, chapter 39. I don't think these words can be repeated enough. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any way. Nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. Chapter 39, Magna Carta. In the USA, with whom the UK has a special relationship that this evening I hope to explain, over this last year, since the 1st of January, 464 people have been shot by police without trial by their equals, disputed whether it's by the law of the land or not, certainly in violation of the Magna Carta that I've just read to you. This is a fact which comes to us from one of your newspapers, The Guardian, which is crowdsourcing this knowledge from people and verifying it by the highest standards of journalism and scholarship to attain this figure. How many are shot by the police? Men, women, and children. Surely you know. The federal government and many of the states cannot be relied on, have neglected this. In fact, the federal government doesn't even have plans to do it. I mention this for two reasons. First of all, to thank, this is too formal, it's an international project. It's a worldwide project. Do you follow me? We rely on The Guardian for this knowledge, and it's a crowdsourced knowledge. It's no longer a state knowledge. I think we're moving into a new epoch where more and more of our activities and of our rule is by commons, is by commoning. Let's use this as a verb. Chapter 7 of Magna Carta says that she shall have meanwhile her estovers in the common. And while we know that Magna Carta and to a less degree the Charter of the Forest is largely an armistice, ending a civil war and ending quarrels within the puny ruling class of the time, nevertheless, both the big and the little charter had to recognize the labors and the work of the 90% of the population, over whom I imagine the bishops of the cathedral looked, or of the castle. When you go around the walls, there's a 360-degree view of the fields and of the landscape, overlooking the wealth that is produced. For any knight's horse, 40 serfs at least were required to feed that horse, not to mention the knight or his family. So I come after a year of struggle back home. I'm from Michigan, led by African American parts of our working class, led by a historic struggle against slavery. A struggle against slavery that culminated in 1865 with the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that includes language from the Magna Carta, as does the Federal Constitution of 1787. So in America, you will find in courthouses that chapter that I read aloud to you, sometimes carved in granite on the walls. In former generations, children had to memorize that chapter 39. So we feel it's also, this is not a national document to us. Though I'm coming to you tonight, I hope, to begin an exploration of a social history of the commons and of the practice of commoning. And I hope tonight to interest you in 4 or 5 arches of British history over the 800 years, from 1215 to now, in the history of the commons. I like speaking to you this way. And I hope to return to our setting, but I don't think I'll do it right at the moment. Instead, I want to take you to the 12th of April, 1945, just a few weeks before the end of the European War, World War II, I mean, when a young American, Howard Zinn, woke up in his Quonset hut in a little town named Eye in Suffolk. Eye was the headquarters of the 490th Bomb Group of the United States 8th Air Force. The 8th had 112 air stations in England. Most were not in Lincolnshire, which, as I understand, is largely RAF territory, than in other parts of East Anglia. They flew B-17s, or flying fortresses, and Howard Zinn was a bombardier aboard one of these called the Belle of the Brawl, a typical name provided by these lusty young bombers who mixed Eros and Thanatos. Looking at the countryside from the air, the runways form huge triangles across a checkered landscape whose rectangular fields were defined by the post-enclosure hedges. The runways were paved by some 12,000 African Americans in England at the time in a vast earth-changing labors, similar to the hydraulic works organized by the Romans and then by the Dutch, Cornelius Vermuyden, one of the triggers that led to Cromwell and the English Revolution of the 1640. Now, many of the African Americans in England who made the runways will return to the U.S. as veterans in the American Civil Rights Movement. Just as in Lincolnshire, many fenmen who had been enclosed tenaciously held to the commons and had sought at one time to turn the world upside down. Like the Weaver, who led a sect called Manifestarians, which include women to preach, and who believed to have seen Christ visibly. Now, Howard Zinn was from one of the finest slums of Brooklyn. He was totally gung-ho about the war. Before that mission, he met a pilot who told him, you know, this war isn't about fascism. It's an imperialist war about who's going to be top dog, the USA or the USSR. Then why are you here? Zinn replied. To talk to guys like you. And the pilot went off on his last mission and didn't return. Zinn, I imagine, shook his head and climbed aboard the Belle of the Brawl. And along with 1,150 other bombers, they dropped their payload over Rouen, a seaside village in the estuary of Bordeaux, and thousands perished. Their payload consisted of jellied gasoline or liquid fire. Here's a fire. Thank you to the artist. This fire is napalm. After the war, unlike many bombardiers, Howard Zinn visited Rouen and spoke to the relatives of those who had perished. He regretted his role. I don't know him personally enough to know whether his subsequent career was an act of making amends or not, but he became a peacenik and an anti-war militant. He became a historian, and his people's history of the USA is immensely popular. And in it he wrote, "There are victims, there are executioners, and there are bystanders." In the dynamics of our time, when heads roll into the basket every hour, what is true varies according to what happens to your own head, and objectivity of the bystander calls for inaction while other heads fall. Now, although it was King John who provided the Suffolk borough of Eye with its borough in 1205, I do not think that Howard Zinn dropped napalm and wiped out thousands in une tragique erreur on behalf of Magna Carta. But back at the time of the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq, as an anti-war historian, I asked Howard Zinn about Magna Carta and how he might help, what its meaning was to the United States. And he referred to its history in the American labor movement and the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. But Zinn had fought and had dropped those bombs for the Atlantic Charter, which 4 years earlier had enunciated the four freedoms. Do you know them? Is there anyone in this hall who can recite the four freedoms? Would you signify so by raising your hand, please? Then I shall repeat them to you. These are chartered freedoms. In Newfoundland, Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill sat down. Churchill didn't like them, but nevertheless, to get arms, he had to acquiesce to them. They are freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. Want not as desire for more consumer materials, but want as subsistence, as life. They were not actual law. They were not the Constitution. They were not a binding treaty. They were more akin to a secular covenant, and even still under Noah's rainbow sign. And kids like Howard Zinn believed in it, at least until the nameless pilot started talking to him. So while the Lincoln Magna Carta was transported to America for safekeeping during the anti-fascist war and stuck next to the gold in the Fort Knox vault in Kentucky, where it sat during the war for safekeeping, people like Howard Zinn were part of the effort to maintain that safety. Okay, now, Howard Zinn is known for history from below, but I'm not sure I like this expression. I think it falls under the fallacy of altitude. You know, that puts the king high on the throne, the judge high on the bench, the officer high on the high horse, and the bombardier in the sky, not to speak of monotheism. This fallacy infects our language, and we need to be careful or aware of it. So many of our prepositions and our attitudes to people place them in relationship to altitude, to elevation. So I have this question about history from below. Rather, I have tried to write history by the neck. And my first book was called The London Hanged. It's this kind of hanging that we find here in the castle, or some remnants from those days. And I studied those who were hanged in London at Tyburn Fair, where Irish, African Americans, Scottish, Welsh, as well as English, dangled from the sheriff's picture frame. Those of us, let's see. The hangman, William Marwood, like the bombardier Howard Zinn, experimented with technologies of death. And Marwood was the inventor of the long drop, you know. First employed here in 1876. This snapped the neck instead of strangulating the windpipes, which was a longer death, 20 minutes or even longer. Marwood combined two factors, weight and distance, to develop a table which would execute death quickly without severing the head. The Home Office issued a booklet, called the Official Table of Drops, which is still used in Singapore. And I don't know whether or not it was used in Pakistan last weekend. In the 13th century, 800 years ago, there were in Lincolnshire about 100 gallows. I learned this from Graham Platts, whose Land and People in Medieval Lincolnshire is volume 4 of the History of Lincolnshire, published by the Committee for the Society of Lincolnshire History and Archaeology in 1985. You could not be more than 5 miles from any gallows in Lincolnshire at the time of the Magna Carta or the Charter of the Forest. Oh, man. No, thank you, Matt. I like the moment of bending down, and it gives me a moment to think a bit and to calm down, because I can work myself up with these subjects. Again, we are in this prison, and over there we've been talking to different castle experts and very helpful groundspeople to learn about where the hanged are buried and to learn about the tree possibly used at one point, and then where the long drop was used at another point. So between this venue, surrounded by those places, it's difficult to remain peaceful, or for me it is, because these are class facts. These are facts of our human society. Of an upper class and a lower class to fall guilty to the fallacy of altitude. I want to remember John Lilburn. I want to remember the Levelers. I want to remember the Party of Struggle. John Lilburn in Lincolnshire in the 1640s was invited and said, "This is our common," referring to Lincolnshire. Where the means of production, the means of subsistence, the means of human reproduction were not monopolized by a few in order to enslave the many. This is a truth that grows even more glaring in the USA, and I believe in the UK, these two countries with this special relationship and this quasi-adoration of the Magna Carta. Now I have a section in my lecture called The Toff's Last Gasp. It might be premature, but nevertheless, I thought I'd give it a try. I'm referring to the charming history professor of Harvard, Jill Lepore, writing in the New Yorker last month about Magna Carta, saying that the Americans took it totally wild. I refer to Lord Sumption, who, in my wild way, I call Lord somebody or other. He belongs to the Million a Year Club, is a judge on the Supreme Court of the UK. He begins his lecture at the British Library by saying, "It is impossible to say anything new about Magna Carta unless you say something mad." And coming from a high court judge, such a statement makes me want to duck. I want to become invisible, because anyone with any historical consciousness knows that madness in 1801 was introduced precisely to keep people detained for their whole life. As in the Soviet Union. You do not need to follow criminal procedures or those checks which we read together in Chapter 39 of Magna Carta, if you can find someone insane or mad. It's the way husbands would control their wives. It's essential to patriarchy. In the 18th century, certainly. I don't know about earlier. So I get nervous when a high court judge, a Tory, I know he's being ironic, but it makes me nervous. Because I think the toffs I think there is a kind of grin, there's a kind of humor that, is it called bloody-mindedness? I'm not sure. I don't want to say anything rude. But I do wish to point a finger at this Lord Sumption. It's one of the toffs. He said that Magna Carta, speaking as a judge, has nothing to do with habeas corpus. He says it has nothing to do with trial by jury. He says it has nothing to do with rule by law. Okay, I think he's wrong. I think it's mad. Oops. No, this is a second voice of the toffs. Now there's a third voice from the toffs that I want to bring to us. I think I'm doing this right here. Oh no. Here I've got a bit of rhetoric. Can I try that? Try this one out on you. Lord Sumption said that Magna Carta just protected the financial interests of a few tenants-in-chief, a very small group, perhaps 150 to 180 men. Okay, that's, about double our size. Well, I'm not interested in the 150, 180 tenants-in-chief of the 13th century, or of the 1% in the 21st century. That history, I think, is truly both mad and wrong. Lord Sumption had said that some documents are less important for what they say than for what people wrongly think about it. So we're speaking as both wrong and mad. But that 1% had provided war, death, scarcity, and their works have poisoned the earth, sky, and sea. They march past us proudly, displaying the skulls of the defeated, still dripping blood, absorbed by the dead skin of dead animals, or archival parchment gnawn by rats. But the 1% no longer lead the victory parade. We've had enough of Lord Something's 150 or 180 tenants-in-chief as the sole subjects of history. Be gone with them, I say. Away. That history should belong only to a tiny minority, is the niggardly view of history. Okay, there's my rhetoric, and there's my rebuke. Yes. I think I stand by it. Now, where was I going to go? Oh, yes, to Ferdinand Mount, who I think is a novelist. I don't know, is he a politician? Is he an MP? A journalist, a novelist, and whose cousin is the mother of the Prime Minister of England, David Cameron. And he begins his article on the Charters of Liberty with a bit of bathroom humor, referring to the Magna Carta. And, I've lost my page 5. He says it's simply bad history. It belongs to the dustbin. But not all the clauses, he admits, are destined to the rubbish tip. He likes those clauses favoring merchants and easing commerce. The middle classes were on their way, he says. Okay. So those are my 3 toffs. One calls the Americans wild, the other that we're mad or wrong, and this last one is a bit mixed, but refers to a scatological interpretation, which of course he doesn't put in his own mouth right away. He says that Oliver Cromwell said it first, the Magna Carta business. Now, here I'm a bit mixed in my lecture. I mentioned earlier 5 arches, and then there's 3 words that I want to explain. But I thought I should interrupt right now to talk about one phrase and one view, since we're here. Here at the doors, which I think are open, though there's a grating on some of them. I want to take you to the 4th arch of the history of the Commons. This would be, forgive me on this is dates. You know, us historians, we love dates. And actually, it's not, we tend to see history, as a line. And that's the way, but I'm now thinking of it as a bridge. And there's these 5 arches. But the 5th arch, just to jump way ahead, would be the 1940s, at the time that Howard Zinn flew, and that many people here, perhaps your parents or grandparents, flew or are veterans of that war, and where freedom from want was the name that the state gave to the commons, or the common welfare, or subsistence for all. Yes. Either poverty must use democracy to destroy the power of property, or property in fear of democracy will hurt poverty. Who said that? If you know, raise your hand. Thank you. 1941, Aneurin Bevan, the father, do we say, of the National Health Service. Thank you for those words. That comes from the 5th arch, do you see? The arch that began to use the state as a means of commoning, or subsistence for all. Now, before there was another arch that I want to refer to called the 4th arch, and that's the 1790s. Let's say the era, you may know it as the Napoleonic Wars. I know it as the birth of the USA, and we should know it as the birth of the UK, 1801. I mean, who's Irish? Are there Irish people here tonight? Well, 1801 and the Act of Union destroyed an independent Ireland, and that's when we have our UK. The USA is just 10 years earlier. So these two political formations, the USA and the UK, had this special relationship. And what I've been thinking about more recently is that this relationship is based on material facts and material developments having to do with the textile trade. Because the whole opening of the American South was an opening for enslavement and for the conquest of land. The destruction of the Native American forms of commoning and its replacement by massive and terrorized enslavement. In 1801, at the time of this Fourth Arch, there was a man in prison. A new prison, a prison like this, built on the principles of silence and separation. That principle is called the New Prison. It's near what's the Clerkenwell House of Clerkenwell House of Correction, the New Prison, or sometimes called Coldbath Fields. It's from the mid of the 1790s, and it's the first prison in London that's built on the principles that we have here. But what I want to say about this, what I'm speaking now as history by the neck, is that the prisoners have a voice. The people in those prisons know something, and we historians should find out what it is that they know. And it gave me such joy yesterday, such powerful joy, to go into one of the rooms here and find that the caretakers of this building had discovered graffiti that had been composed in the 19th century by Joseph Trigg, who had stolen 5 geese. Now, I have your attention. Take up your papers, please, that has been kindly given to you. Turn it over and recite with me what you may already know by heart, I assume. We are in Lincolnshire, a great county of grain, a great county of wandering harvest workers from Ireland, Romanese, Fen people. And let's say together that with me now, the law locks up, steals the... Thank you. You are beautiful. This is beautiful. This is beautiful. I wish I had that recording. I would take it home. It would be precious to me to have these Lincolnshire voices recite this greatest of English poems. Anonymous, of course. The law locks up the man or woman. And when they lock him up, it's in such places. Who steals the goose from off the common, just what Joseph Trigg did. And he's memorialized on a piece of graffiti that was written here. In 1805, he was sent off to Botany Bay, to Australia, along with a man who, what was his name? Waymark, who stole two pieces of wood. Now, I don't know whether those 2 pieces of wood were chips or whether they were Estovers. Now, here, at the risk of really getting lost, going down some rabbit hole, I want to introduce Estovers to you. I don't want you leaving the hall today, this is a professor speaking, without knowing the meaning of Estovers. Oh, shame on you, Peter. I thought I knew. Because chapter 7, remember, says that the widow shall have her Estovers in the common. Well, what are Estovers? I thought I had to look it up, so I'm going to go to Edward Cook, the finest interpreter and the classic interpreter of Magna Carta, who Charles I, didn't like at all and tried to destroy his papers, but he was unsuccessful. Cook died, but Parliament at the beginning of the Civil War or Revolution found the papers and explained that, and then these are the institutes, Cook's institutes, And you can read, he interprets Estovers as plow boat, fuel boat, house boat. I'm not sure I'm saying this right. It's Anglo-Saxon words, the suffix, the B-O-T-E at the end. This meant that you could go out into the woods and collect wood for your fuel boat. Or you could collect wood for building your house or making repairs. Or you could collect wood for a plow or for a rake handle or other implements of labor. Do you see? You have access to fuel. You can cook. You have access to the means of reproduction. You have access to habitation, to shelter. So I thought, that's what Estovers is. And for several years, I went about saying this to different venues and different people. That was the meaning of Estovers. How am I doing on time, please? There's only 20 minutes left? All right, fair enough. We could have a kind of break here, and is it going all right so far? Do you think? Okay, I take that as nobody's walked out yet. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but yeah. So there I was being the professor to you and going back to Cook about Estovers. Well, by accident, I come across John Rastall. Anyone know him? I think he married Thomas More's sister or something. And he wrote a dictionary of law terms that was reproduced in 1640. So it's like almost 100 years later, or more than 100 years. And so I saw what he had to say about Estovers, and he says, you must go back to Bracton. Bracton's a medieval jurist who wrote in the same century at the same time as Magna Carta. So I thought, okay, I'll go back to Bracton and just see what he has to say about Estovers. And here's what he had to say. The widow or the single woman who's divorced or otherwise separated has Estovers. So that's a little bit broader, isn't it? This is why the first commentator of Magna Carta said that apart from the prohibition of capital punishment for killing a deer, the most important part of Magna Carta was against the disparagement of women. Yes. I wonder if the Queen said that today in her speech, or whether Cameron remembered it or not. Then there's a third category that can have Estovers that really pertains to us, according to Bracton, and then according to the Rastall and the Dictionary of Law Terms of 1640, and that is any imprisoned felon and his family. And I thought, if only our imagination, political and legal, could go back to Bracton and this clause, what a vast boon it would be to the incarcerated millions in North America who are miles away from their family. They're miles away from clothing, good food, healthy food, and their families suffer. Why can't we in our law schools, why can't we, those of us who are historians and who love the past, bring this forward, just as Cook brought forward chapter 39? There are parts of Magna Carta that I want to bring forward into the 21st century, and the foundation of that bringing forth and bringing forward and realizing the potential of these charters of liberty is the commons, where the privatization of the means of life, the means of production, the means of reproduction, where the land itself is not the property of a single class, but belongs to all. Oh, Linebaugh, you've gone way too far. There's a utopianism. Don't you know the beginnings of this? Did you never read Garrett Hardin on the tragedy of the commons, my dear fellow? Oh. Well, we have 800 years at least of untold millions of people dealing with this problem. My teacher, Edward Thompson, took us all to talk with Miss Mabel Ashby in the Cotswolds, who wrote a wonderful book about her father, Joseph Ashby, who was the secretary of the Tyso Pig Club, where they had kept pigs and let pigs out in the forest. Oh, there's my second term that I want everyone to remember, which is pannage. You'll find Estovers we had in the Magna Carta. Now we got pannage in the Charter of the Forest. And pannage says you can put your pigs into the forest, not whenever you like, but between Michaelmas and Martinmas. That is, when the acorns and the mast and the beech nuts are out. And with a pig, a family can subsist quite well. You can have your protein, well through the winter. But why slaughter the beast when she might bring forth more pigs? Oh, with what joy today. I must admit, I was frightened by the cathedral overlooking the lands. I was frightened by it. And it's so big, it's so awesome. All I could feel was a kind of an oppressive weight. And then I said, Peter, start thinking now. Get over it. Get over it. And study it. See what's there. And to my joy, what did I find? I found a swineherd on the turret, the swineherd of Stowe. Everybody knows this, I suppose, here in Lincoln. But to me, it was it was new. So I was very happy to see the pig man, right there, blowing his horn. Sorry, 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 calling the pigs from the forest. It was there's pannage for me. It came alive. I was very happy about that. Now I'm about to get lost. I went down a rabbit hole, didn't I? We did Estovers. We did the Estovers in the prison. And then we got the pannage, the second word. But now we're back in the prison, and so let's go to 1801, and we're going to visit the prisoner. But you're going to say, how do you know that, Linebaugh? Because this prisoner he talks about the bum charter. Now I'm back to the scatology, the bum, with our man Ferdinand Mount, who introduced this theme. The prisoners refer to the bum charter. Oh, well, how do you know that, Peter? Because the guy in prison in 1801, his name was James Hardy Vaux. Have any of you read him? Yeah, in 1968, it was republished. He wrote a flash dictionary. That's when you want to talk, but you don't want others to understand what you're saying. You speak in cant or flash language. And it's a type of commoning. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose. So those who lost, like Trigg, who was here, off to Australia for stealing geese, he had to speak some language where the rulers wouldn't know, but he's in Australia. But he's doing pretty well in Australia, not Trigg, but James Hardy Vaux. And in 1810, the superintendent of the prisoners in Australia said, look, I can't understand what people are saying. Would you please explain to me? And he wrote a dictionary as a result. It's very important, how this dictionary came to pass, because you're not going to find much about sex in it. Hardly anything at all. Nor are you going to find anything about politics in it. Nothing at all. Even though the prison that this guy had been in 1800, they called it the Steel, short for the Bastille. Remember, this is the era of the French Revolution, which we in North America still think of as liberté, égalité, et fraternité. Now, I'm not going to ask you to say that, but we could anyway. Liberté, égalité et fraternité. In that prison while he was there were the mutineers from the fleet who had gone on mutiny in 1797. And we thank them, don't we? Somebody say something? Because they said there's 16 ounces to the pound. You know, the pursers on the ships were trying to make it 14 ounces. So I always think of the sailors and the mutineers when I do my 16 ounces. And I think you should too. You know, all this measurement comes from some struggle at some time. Anyway, the mutineers who weren't hanged, 34 of them were hanged, were sent to Coldbath Field, were sent to the Bastille. And James Hardy Fox would have known about them. You see, he would have heard about politics, but he doesn't put it in his dictionary. Also, who else was in there but the Irish revolutionary, Edward Marcus Despard. Who knows Despard? Oh, we have our work to do. I'm afraid we're going to stay here for another hour, Matt. No. Not at all. Don't worry. I don't quite mean that. What I'm getting around to saying is that James Hardy Fox stood tippy-toes so he could get to the great, and he put his ears to the great, and he listened to what people were saying. That this silent system and separation system does not prevent human beings from finding some way to communicate. The people's power is stronger than the man's technology. We used to say during the war in Vietnam, when napalm was dropped and all sorts of other technical weapons were used in the thanatocracy. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Sometimes I think the state is an organization of death, to promote to death, or at least to organize it. Who's to live, who's to die. And the Bum Charter didn't refer to the Magna Carta or the Charter of the Forest. It referred to brekkie, the breakfast, which was hot water from the cook's copper and bread. That was the Bum Charter. That's what I wanted to bring to you. I wanted to bring a continuity of struggle in prisons. How much? Yes, I did. And I wanted to relate that to the Magna Carta, not just because of the Bum Charter, but because of Estovers. And my recent discovery, because I only learned this last month as I was preparing a lecture for you, from Bracton, about how Estovers meant maintenance for both the felon, imprisoned felon, and his family. And then I learned that there was a law of Edward, one of the Edwards, I can't remember which, sorry, that said Estovers was to include clothing and meat, when meat meant food, good food. Yeah, so it was statutory at one time. Oh, boy. Oh, yeah. Another word, the third word, is herbage. Herbage, and that's the beginning of the Charter of the Forest. And that's so you can graze your cattle or other livestock in the commons. Herbage. Jeanette Neeson, another one of Edward Thompson's, perhaps his finest student, Jeanette Neeson wrote a wonderful book called Commoners. I recommend it to you all, even though it's not about Lincolnshire, it's about Northamptonshire. But I understand Lincolnshire people are very broad-minded. So it's, yes. Jeanette said that the common of herbage is the most important of all the common rights. And it survives in the world now. Not survives, I mean, it's the livelihood in Oaxaca and in Chiapas in southern Mexico. And that's just places I know personally. But in Indonesia, as I hope to learn later this week, and in many parts of Africa, to be like Uganda. My daughter's in Uganda now, and she's an archivist there. And she sent me a picture of just a street scene, and here's a guy going down, feeding his goats right along the street verge. You know, that verge is a commons. Okay, and look, while I'm at it, let's deal with the Latin. I'm sorry about the Latin. Yes, it says homo idioticus, doesn't it? To femina communis? Okay. That was, I don't know Latin, but I'm intimidated by those who do, and I respect the fact that it's a great scholarly language. And I regret I was a bad Latin student anyway. Homo idioticus. Ian, my colleague here, taught me that idiot comes from the Greek for a private person, not a person of the public. So I thought in this era of privatization, we should think of ourselves as homo idioticus, because we're idiotly poisoning the land and the seas. But then I thought, well, Peter, the history of the commons in England, as a matter of fact, has been written largely by women, by Ivy Pinchbeck, by Alice Clark, by Sheila Rowbotham, by Jeanette Neeson, by Miss Higman here in Lincolnshire, whose article I've been unable to attain in my researches in the Great Lakes region of North America. And hopefully, Hillary, where are you? Or Matt, hopefully tomorrow I can find this article of hers, because she relates the herbage, the common of herbage, to fundamental law. She found this in her work here in Lincolnshire. So I think that's an important scholarly project for us to retrace her steps if need be, but to find out about them anyway. And the thing I wanted to bring to you here, I was very I was excited to learn that just down the road from here, I suppose it's down the road, is Stixwold. Do you know Stixwold? Okay, I don't, and I might say the wrong thing, but somebody in the cathedral told me it's a place of retreats now, like religious stuff. But in 1607, it was a hotbed of levelers. And there was commons around Stixwold. It's only one of several villages. And there was a struggle of some trying to enclose the commons and others trying to common the enclosures. This is Gateward's case. English reports, I've got the citation, we can get it quickly. Much of it's in Latin, but much of it's not. And what it does, you see, unlike the Soviet Union or unlike America, Soviet Union, they had the kulaks in the 1930s, they massacred many of the peasants. In the United States, they just committed genocide of the native people. But here in England, you couldn't get rid of people that quickly or that easily. This is what is so very, this is something. This is something on this planet, I think. It really is. This history of commoning that you have. I'm not saying that you're all mutual and cooperative and lovey-dovey with one another, but you have been, I shouldn't speak this way. Gateward's case said that common rights can adhere not to persons, but to property. This is a fundamental step in the privatization of the commons in England. And it took place, as I say, 16 miles east of here, approximately. Is that right? Is it right to say down the road? Or okay. I haven't been there, so I'm speaking entirely from book knowledge, or from legal knowledge. But what would be important would be to find the story behind it. And there's, when you read the case, and Roger Manning in his book Village Rebels is quite good on the Midland Revolt of 1607. So that would be, in there, and then the English Revolution would be my third arch. Remember the arches that I kind of began with? and I think I'm running out of time if I'm not mistaken. So I'm not going to do too much on the second arch, but the second arch, I do need to mention a couple things about the commons. And that is, you remember Thomas More and Utopia. There's two things about Utopia that we have to remember, is that yes, it did enclose the commons, and it is about this theme of the enclosure of land that you have grown up with, either in school or in actual practice, or you remember even from stories from your grandparents. That is an actuality, and the history of common rights is still something that is very viable and is not distant in memory. Not distant. I'm not saying it's alive, but it could be and it can be. There's many forms of commoning. Uh-oh, I'm losing it. Where was I? Is anyone paying attention? Can tell me where I was. Thomas More, thank you very much. So that's one side of Thomas More. But the other side of Thomas More is America, or Brazil. So there are two sides to Utopia, do you see? There are two sides to the commons. One is the practice that we have here in England. Another part in the history of the commons is from outside of England. Whether it's Utopia, whether at the time of the English Revolution, or the time of Thomas Spence in the Fourth Arch, and back with Henry of, what was his name? James Hardy Vaux, V-A-U-X. He was the bum charter guy. What is so significant about that second arch, there's two things. First, I must, because of Norfolk, I must refer, to the Lincoln Rebellion of 1636, right? And then, which was about the commons, similar to the Prayer Book Rebellion, it's that same year. 1549 is the Ketz Rebellion, when commons will be king, when no lord may common. These are actual expressions that were used by Jack Ketch. I mean, that is a time of maximum struggle, maximum class war. So that would be the second arch. And then the first arch would be at the time of the Magna Carta, the Peasants' Revolt. And who else? Did he have a mate? John Ball. And now, have you read News from Nowhere? Have you read William Morris? One person? Two persons? Three? Four? 4 persons have read. It's short. It's William Morris. Come on. Put him on your list. Mustn't be listening to a lecture like this when you could be reading News from Nowhere. It is beautiful. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It's a riddle. Yeah. Wat Tyler was stabbed in the back on the 15th of June, 1381. 15th of June, okay. Point taken. So I want to combine, this is the first arch, the peasant struggle. You must read William Morris on the death of King John. I'm kind of tempted to conclude with that, but it's not the conclusion that I wrote down. So I better just, I did want to quote the Assistant Secretary to the Colonial Office, 1947, when it was proposed to make Juneteenth, as I call it, an international holiday. K.W. Baxter. Do you mind if I make a little fun? I may not be able to pull this off, Ian. But he says something. There is a danger that the colonial people might be led into an uncritical enthusiasm for a document that they have not read, but which they presume to contain guarantees of every so-called right they might be interested in that moment in claiming. Sorry about that, but you know what I was trying to do. I mean, Magna Carta has meant so much to China with Sun Yat-sen. It's meant so much to Africa with Mandela. It's meant so much to India with Gandhi. All of them will quote Magna Carta. You see, it's a worldwide thing of liberation in that. But it's not a liberation. We're not mad, do you see? We're not mad to dream of the future. We're not mad to think that law can have new interpretations. We're not mad to find new things. I'm speaking to Lord somebody or other again. You know, the Supreme Court man who said to say anything new is mad. Ooh, that chills me. That chills me. Do you say that to your children? Do you say that to kindergartners, first graders? How can you say that? It's beyond me. So that was part of my conclusion. But I didn't say June 15th, did I? I said Juneteenth. Because Juneteenth is the day, on the 19th of June, that finally, 2 years later, the Emancipation Proclamation reached Texas. And the slaves who found themselves freed 2 years later began to celebrate that day, but the authorities, the white power structure, would not permit them to do it. So it was done in secret or in churches, Juneteenth, every 19th. And because the slave struggle in North America and its victory had depended on Magna Carta, I propose that we combine these holidays. We could have it on the 15th and make a Juneteenth. Do you see? As a day against enslavement of any form. And not just as a day to extol the rule of law. On the 24th of November of last year, President Obama said in relationship to the outrage for the failure of the prosecutor in Ferguson, Missouri, to arrest the police officer who had killed Michael Brown. He said, first and foremost, our nation is based on the rule of law. But I think this is a mistake. I don't think it is, as a matter of history. But the expression rule of law is deeply misleading. You don't find it in Magna Carta, even though everyone says that's what it's about. So let's read these texts ourselves with our own minds, with our own questions. Huh? I mean, that's what, well, I am a historian, and that's what we do, but I think we all must. We all must. And then, okay, here's the conclusion, Matt. I began, I hope, with Howard Zinn, but can I just check? Have I gone about an hour or a little bit over? Or what? Okay, about an hour. So Howard Zinn said, look, history cannot provide confirmation that something better is inevitable. Now, as a Marxist, that's what I used to think Karl Marx would say. But as a student of Edward Thompson, I know that's wrong. We have to do it. It's not going to happen by itself. History cannot provide confirmation that something better is inevitable, but it can uncover evidence that it is conceivable. And I think Estovers and Panage and Urbage can help us begin to conceive of a world where our needs are met, our needs can be expressed. And if I have helped you understand a few of the words in these charters of liberty in a new way, then I will be grateful. Thank you.
If I might introduce myself, I'm Professor Duncan French. I'm head of Lincoln Law School, and delighted to be able to sort of compare the final part of this evening. A challenging, infectious, engaging, but also very warm lecture, so thank you very much, Peter. I was just thinking at the end, it's not the sort of talk they'd have probably had in Runnymede today, but I think we've benefited more than they have. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. We'll probably take them in pairs. I think Hilary and Anna are going to do the roving microphone for us. So hands high for anybody who would like to ask a question, and we'll probably do a couple of rounds, so 2 questions at a time. So if you'd like to stand when the microphone comes to you. No.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was very surprised from the tone and direction of your talk that you seem to miss completely one section of Magna Carta that was totally and utterly ignored by everybody in this country after century after century after century, even though it entailed depriving men of their liberty and taking them away from their families. And that, of course, was the press gangs. The press gangs were right outside of Magna Carta, and as I understand it, could only be authorised through royal prerogatives. What are your views on royal prerogatives and press gangs being allowed to deprive men of their liberty?
A second question? If not, we'll do one question at a time.
As incarcerated, it's just a prison with a chance of drowning, as Dr. Johnson said. Yeah. Pressed, the king's shilling, drunkenness. You know, the Navy SEALs were trained with drink and drunkenness. You know, the ones who went after Osama bin Laden. It's a big thing in the New York Times last week. The importance of alcoholism and drug abuse to the formation of the soldier and sailor in times of war. I'm just thinking of the so-called ceremonies of, you know, taking the king's shilling, getting drunk, you know, in the different brothels where impressment would take place. William Lovett, you know, the wonderful chartist, he as a boy had to run and hide in the cornfields when the press gang came through, and the women would help him. His labor was needed, he was needed, not to go off to sea. There's a Canadian, actually may still be a British citizen, I don't know, his name is Nicholas Rogers, and he's written a wonderful book about the press gang. What's come to my mind, sir, is the American Declaration of Independence has 28 reasons for declaring independence from Great Britain, and one of them concerns the coerced labor of seamen, of sailors. And then, of course, what the Americans call the War of 1812, which concerned the Great Lakes, and it's a very good time when the White House itself was burnt down by British soldiers. That war was fought also over impressment. Nowadays, of course, the United States cannot afford to impress a conscripted, drafted army after the experience in Vietnam, because so many soldiers would shoot in the sky instead of at their so-called brothers. You remember Muhammad Ali saying, "No Viet Cong ever called me the N-word." So thank you very much for your question. Thanks for reminding us and linking the war machine to Magna Carta and to that great chapter 39 that I just read. Thank you very much.
Another question?
Hello.
Hello.
I very much enjoyed your book on the Magna Carta Manifesto.
Well, thank you.
I wondered if you might say something more about the feminization of poverty today and perhaps the second part of your Latin title and the Femina Communis.
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't. And thank you for asking. I mean, the people who are first hit by the loss of common rights are mothers and grandmothers. I'm thinking of the city, the province of Michoacán in Mexico, where there has been a struggle over usos y costumbres, the customs and usages of timber by the women there. And the drug wars and the state police have taken this away from the women, who now live in increased poverty and cannot even light their fires. The bombing in Afghanistan has also destroyed forms of commoning that women had used. I don't praise this. This is not the way to the future, I think, of getting up at 4 a.m. and collecting kindling and twigs and timber to light the breakfast fire. But it was and has been for many people the source of fuel. I'm not saying we need to go back to it, but once you destroy that possibility, you leave the women and children with nothing. So that was in my mind with the feminization of poverty I'd read about from the wonderful feminist commoner, Silvia Federici, who is speaking this weekend in Greece. Her book, called Caliban and the Witch, I highly praise because she expresses a theme that lamentably was absent in today's lecture, but it concerns, which I gesture to only with the expression femina communis, because I think not only have women historians told the story of the commons, but I think in the past commoning was not a women's job, but she was not excluded from production as she will with the advent of capitalist relations of production. She had a role in the production of life in all its means, in production. Not to mention, like, access to the woods it's the, what do you call the medicine cabinets? It's the pharmacopoeia. Access to the woods, or commoning in the open field system. I mean, thank you for this question. It's really fundamental. And the historians I mentioned, that, Jeanette Neeson particularly, but you also see it in the older work of Ivy Pinchbeck, is in the keeping of chickens, the keeping of pigs, the keeping of livestock, the tending the garden, not to mention the harvest cooperative labors, is work where men and women work side by side. And in some of those jobs, it's her work. And she can then use the eggs that her chickens produce in order to get some money at market. So she has some independence in commoning regimes that are not possible in the so-called industrial capitalism. Now, the reason I say femina communis is that I might not be right here, but I had thought of, because of the word homosexual, I thought homo kind of meant men. And why should men stand for all of us? You see, why should a word in a foreign language for man mean everybody? Okay, if that's the case, let's spend a few centuries where the word in a foreign language for woman stands for everybody. And I thought, okay, let's try femina. So that's why I put from homo idioticus to femina communis. Does that somewhat answer your question? Thank you very much for it.
Sir.
I'm somewhat problematized by the rhetoric surrounding the historic site and its serving up to the public as a kind of theatricalised space. And coming here a few weekends ago, there was a mock hanging, a medieval hanging, under which children sat and sort of waited for this effigy to swing around. And then when it had happened, they clapped. And I just wondered what's your take on being in this somewhat theatricalised space and in these sort of grounds as being, what's been your kind of take on that? Have you seen any of this sort of reenactment?
Well, look, man, I mean, we live in the UK is a class society. This, like all societies, and it rules by terror. And the terror of, just as I told the story of the Commons with its 5 arches or whatever you think of that, parallel to that is the story of death, is of organized death, of hangings. Every 5 miles in Lincolnshire there's a gallows. You can't go walking without seeing someone dangling from a tree. You know, it's like lynching. Like in the United States with lynching now, there's a big movement to memorialize each spot, you know, with a plaque or some other ways. This is where this crime took place. Beginning to see this not as state law and order, not as orderly human communities, but as human crimes. And to teach children that it's funny, to begin to teach gallows humor is the first step to teaching, well, I'm not sure, this is my own opinion now, I'm sure there must be psychiatrists, psychologists, and others who have different viewpoints, but I think it begins to teach, it begins to brutalize. You know, you learn how to accept blood and laugh at, where's my tie, you know, to laugh at this. But we needn't do that. So I don't want to say, the people here have treated me very graciously, here, both the prison staff and the castle staff, and I don't know the exact circumstances of the mock hanging they had and inviting children, but I personally, I don't, you know, as an educator, I don't think, I wouldn't do it myself, and I don't think it's a good pedagogy. Henry Fielding thought it was a good pedagogy. They studied Aristotle, you know, how to make terror, how to create terror. You know, it's a science. There's much literature behind this. There's much human knowledge and human practices from different ruling classes on how to make us afraid and how to make us ignorant. I know it's, but we don't have to settle for it. You know, we can do something else. I think you can, and I think I would like to thank Ann Jones very much, and I would like to thank the artists who invited me here very much for making it possible for us to gather like this, making it possible for me to remember and tell you about News from Nowhere and the great William Morris, for me to get you to start thinking about these charters. I'm sure you have already. It's wonderful, and this work must continue. And I think with Ann Jones, with Derek and Emma, the artists who invited me, this is a wonderful beginning to the discovery of commoning in the past and the creation of it in the future. But it is a struggle, and it must be a struggle. If it's not a struggle, then you're doing something wrong.
I think we've run out of time for questions, and actually you've started to preempt my thank yous, if that's okay, Peter. I wanted to thank everyone at the castle, particularly John Hogan and Anne Wallace. Wanted to thank our funders, the Magna Carta Trust, Lincoln Culture and Art Partnership, the Arts Council England, and we've had further support from Lincoln Business Improvement Group, Bishop Grotet University, both the city and the county council, and Visit Lincoln. But most of all, to thank you for the most excellent talk this evening by Peter Linebaugh. Thank you.